Thank you very much. I was sitting there taking all that in, going, Janie, how do you follow him? Well, that's fantastic. I've never seen a graph like that. That was a brilliant graph. The first one's the uppy downy one. My. And I come from an economics background to begin with, so all of that stuff was probably aimed at people like I used to be. Well, we'll see. I thought that was really fascinating. I thought that Laura's stuff was really fascinating. I think it's like motherhood and apple pie when you hear about the issues, when you look at the news, you see what's going on around the world, and you think about the impact of the changes, and you realize how invisible some of it is, like these gases in the air, but it's not invisible when you look at the impact in terms of the environment or in terms of our lives or in terms of our threats and so on. And it is the poorest and the poor of the world who suffer the most, because they're in the areas in terms of climate change where I guess they've contributed the least to the emissions which are there, but they're very, very vulnerable in terms of weather and in terms of crops and in terms of all of those things as well. So it is very, very important that stuff is done as much as possible to do it, but as much as possible it's very, very hard to get people to do it, no matter what moral pressures you put on them. When it comes down to the practicalities of paying for the change, people are always resisting. When it comes to the practical issues in terms of we want to put up a windmill here, it could go on forever. If you decide you need to put a pylon here, you can stop a city for a week with the protests. So there are no easy choices. It's easy to see the pictures, and that was a most impressive example in a very short period of time of some of the big issues which are just overwhelming, I think, in terms of what we have to deal with. But everybody thinks somebody else is going to deal with it. They like it to be dealt with, but they don't really want to do it themselves because they don't want to put up with the intrusions of the infrastructure or the costs in terms of the changes. And to some extent, some of that is probably what I'm going to say here. So I'll start with saying, did you know that the Liberty Hall in Dublin, you know where SIPTU's building is, it's 60 metres high. And it's also 17.5 metres across at the bottom and 17.5 metres across at the bottom. So it's a square. And you're saying, well, why would I even know that? Well, I know it because I was looking one day, and John mentioned something there about one of his slides, the amount of ice which is coming from the Antarctic ice sheets. I think it was 150 billion tonnes, he was saying. Well, I came across a newer report from new analysis about a month and a half ago, which was published in the Geographical Research Letters by scientists using the most recent data from the European Space Agency's spacecraft Cryosat. And they were saying 160 billion. So I was saying 160 billion tonnes of ice. I've got to explain that to people. What does that mean? And in all honesty, 160 billion tonnes of ice meant nothing to me. I couldn't visualize what 160 billion tonnes of ice was. And this is coming every year. The pace of the reduction in the ice sheet is accelerated and maybe very, very significantly faster than what people thought on the basis of these things. So I began to say, well, how would you visualize what's going on? And I thought of Liberty Hall. I thought it looks like a blooming ice cube, actually, if you really stand back and you look at it far enough. So I said, okay, 17.5 by 17.5 by 60. And I went back to my second year, third year mathematics, and I said, I know how you can get the cubic capacity of the Liberty Hall. And I multiplied them together, and it's 8,375 cubic meters. And then I said, well, how much is a ton of ice? Well, very handy. Like a ton of ice is a meter squared of ice, because of the way water, 1 gram and 1 cc and all that kind of stuff. So I said, well, that's great. So I was able to calculate the weight of ice if Liberty Hall was it. And then I said, well, how much is 160 billion tonnes of ice? And it turns out it's 8.7 million ice cubes the size of Liberty Hall. Every year, that's melting. I said, yes, I can now visualize that, and that's just the Antarctic ice sheet. It's got nothing to do with Greenland, and it's not the glaciers and so on. It's just a huge amount of ice. If you put Liberty Hall ice cubes end to end, you go around the world 13 times every year with the amount that's been melted. If you think about it, you could go to the moon and a third of the way back with that distance of ice every year of ice cubes. If you think about it in terms of, John was mentioning and showed all the graphs about all our houses being swamped. Like, if it was 160 billion tonnes of ice, an area the size of Ireland, 84,000 square kilometres, you'd bury it under 2 metres of water every single year with that amount of ice. That's 20 metres in a decade, and it's accelerating. So it is huge. And when you think about the impact of that, I think, to me, it's not a question of whether it's like we get it all the time. You know, the BBC have been dealing with it lately in terms of saying, in terms of balance on environmental debates, it's become very controversial that they've just recently said that we don't believe that we should be having a one-for-one climate skeptic on every time we have somebody talking about the environment, because the science is now so strong that you don't have to do this balance anymore. And it's become very controversial in the UK. We haven't had that conversation in RTE, but every time we do put a climate story on, we'll get somebody on saying something opposite as well, on the phone or on an email and so on. But I think when you think about, that's about whether or not it's man-made climate change. When you think about what's going on, that level of ice melt, it doesn't seem to matter to me, really, whether it's man-made or otherwise. That's almost academic in one sense. It does matter because it does. But it's really, what are we going to do about it when these people come on and complain that we blame them for climate change? What are we going to do about it is the issue. And I guess on that front, there are no easy answers. That the EPA has pointed out, and Laura was making the point, that we're not going to achieve our targets, and John also made that point too, by 2020. The targets that we have been given, that it's impossible really to get Ireland's emissions down to anything like that level. And as the economy recovers, which we all hope it will, you're going to have more jobs, more transport, more distribution, more economic activity, more electricity consumption, more emissions. You know, and we're faced with what John was just describing. What are we going to do about it? So it's a really, really difficult challenge. You know, per capita, I think Ireland is calculated as having the 4th highest greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. Thanks, of course, to our agricultural output, which I'll come back to. So when I look at it, I think that we could do more, because we must do more. You know, at the end of the day, we're doing as much as a lot of countries in Europe are doing, but we could do an awful lot more. I'll give you an example on environmental taxes. You know, if governments use taxation from time to time to encourage economic change and behavioural change, you know, you'd expect to see environmental taxes, if we're very serious about this issue, go up as a proportion of GDP. It hasn't gone up at all since the year 2000. It's floating around 2.5% of GDP, our environmental taxes. When you look at environmental taxes as a proportion of overall taxes and social insurance, again, you wouldn't be very impressed. You would think that not enough effort is going on. You know, and by those environmental taxes, the kind of things that economists talk about are things like the taxes on petrol and diesel, the taxes on electricity, the National Oil Reserve Agency level, carbon taxes, vehicle registration tax, air travel tax, motor tax, plastic bag levy, landfill levies, fishery protection, all of those things. When you add them all together, you'll find that it's about €4.1 billion a year. And that really is about 8.7% of our overall taxes, which is quite low compared to where it would have been a couple of years ago. So on that front, it says, well, maybe we could do more if we were really serious about trying to change people's behaviour. And that is a typical instrument that governments use to encourage people to do the right thing. And we don't appear to have been doing it as aggressively if we were really serious about the challenge that we have just been presented with. We could possibly do more on that. But when you do think about that, and without getting too hard on ourselves, I think it's worth just stopping for a second and saying, okay, are we that bad compared to everybody else? And when you compare our environmental taxes across the EU, you find that as a proportion of overall taxes, we're not doing that badly, actually, overall. If you look at what other countries are doing, the only 3 other European countries, in only 3 others, do environmental taxes account for a larger overall share than ours. So, yeah, we can do more, but so can everybody else. And we may kind of look at that and feel a bit guilty because maybe we should be doing more, that the story is so stark. But we're not at the bottom of the queue. We're actually ahead of the game in terms of our environmental tax burden compared to most other countries, bar 3, in the European Union. You know, just for information, it's Bulgaria, Slovenia and the Netherlands have a higher proportion of environmental taxes compared to the rest of the taxation system. So I think that that's worth bearing in mind. Obviously, for us, the big problem is transportation and agriculture, which was mentioned, and how we're going to do it. When you look at the overall burden of our carbon taxes, according to all the calculations done by people like John and Laura, I think agriculture is about a third of our carbon emissions. And I think transportation is about 20%, but it used to be 9% when we were a weak economy back in 1990, so that's gone up. When you look at the things that we have to get down ourselves, the ones which are not the emissions trading systems targets, agriculture is 42% at the moment, or 42% of the non-emissions trading carbon that we're producing, which is why we are so high on a per capita basis, because I don't think our lifestyles are particularly more, our distribution of our houses may be not ideal, because we're all travelling longer distances than you might be if you lived in an apartment in a European city. But apart from that, I don't necessarily think that compared to other Europeans that there's something that stands out about the way we live our lives. It's agriculture and that element of transportation which make us outliers, which make us the fourth highest emitters, I think, in the world. And that Food Harvest 2020, as John showed you there, those targets do put a very big onus on us. But the thing is, I think we have to be realistic. An economy on the floor, trying to pick itself up, looking to see where in the world we can make our mark. What can we do indigenously to encourage economic growth, development, jobs for our people, which are going to give us the resources to do the things we really need to do? You know that we have an economic model which is that the Industrial Development Authority tries to attract inward investment. It's been the same now for 30, 40 years, with relatively low taxes on multinational companies who come here and spill over the jobs and bring a bit of tax revenue to us, and on the back of that, that's our silly economic model. The Germans think it's awfully silly because they can't understand what we actually get out of it ourselves. When you see that they're about to change international taxation laws, which could impact on that, could change the incentive potentially for companies to want to use Ireland as a base for tax reasons. Maybe we're exposed on that too. Well, if they pull the plug on that, what else has Ireland got to offer? Our main export is grass. That's what our main export is, the green emerald isle. It's beef and it's dairy. In whatever way you look at it, that's our biggest number one thing. So we're sitting here saying, should we or should we not be trying to develop it? And we're up against this big, big challenge that John just pointed out. I think that is head-wrecking stuff for policymakers, and head-wrecking stuff for us in terms of the moral issues associated with it. Because, of course, we all want to do the right thing. And yet, at the same time, we have to live. If at the end of the day we're saying, well, will we annihilate? I did a report recently, and it was on electric cars. And it was one of my early reports. The ESB had decided that they were launching this big initiative whereby they'd have electric car ambassadors, because there's an awful lot of new electric cars around and available. In fact, I actually own an electric car, and I would highly recommend it, and particularly to anybody who's a two-car family. It's like a pay rise. It's brilliant. But the reality is, when I did this report, I got this complaint. I got a couple of complaints. You can't touch an environment story without getting a complaint. And I'm doing them as straight and as good as I can, because people have their ideas and their issues. And the complaint was that this was crazy. We were presenting, which never mentioned electric cars as being zero emission. And somebody was absolutely irate about this. Emissions were never actually mentioned, as far as I remember, because obviously emissions are created for the electricity which power those cars. And this person said the solution and what we need to do is we need to get rid of all of the farm animals. We need to exterminate all farm animals. And I said it was just electric cars, but it's farm animals. So it's sitting there, so to being practical and doing the right thing. The moral challenges and the issues and the questions that we have to address are terribly hard when you look at what John and Laura have presented. On wind, I think we're currently fourth in the world in terms of the proportion of wind generation on our electricity system. And we can go better than that. I was down with EirGrid recently, and they were telling me they had up to 50% on certain days earlier this year and late last winter of our electricity, which was wind. And so that is off the scale, and people are very, very impressed with that internationally. And they want to change their technology and understanding so that they can get up to 75%. So they're really gung-ho about it. And there's this argument that, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, Britain had an advantage because it had coal. And at the start of this stage, maybe we have an advantage because we have a natural advantage in terms of wind. So let's generate it, let's do it, that's great. But my God, again, it's the same issue. Everywhere I go, it's a windmill is a problem for some people, and a pylon is a problem for some people, and the protests are incredible. And the organisation of them I'm very struck by as well. The picture I got sent to me recently, only this week, I was down in a place called Mount Lucas, near where Bord na Móna have just finished a wind farm. It's an 84 megawatt wind farm. And I flew over it and I saw it, and it looked fairly like a cutaway bog to me, with not a lot of people living near it. Well, I got these photographs of these houses that were supposedly dominated by this windmill, which was a kilometre away. Now, the windmill, I don't know how they got the shot. I don't know how something a kilometre away that's 56 metres up to the core could have looked that big compared to a house. So I'm very suspicious about the way they twist the story to highlight their concern. Now, they have concerns and they're all legitimate, but all I'm pointing out is that it is very, very difficult to do the right thing in a country like Ireland. Really difficult. Because everybody has a different objection or a problem. Or what are we going to do with the farmers? The wind, when we look at it, one of the big issues which is often put to me is that, the windmills, we have to have all our electricity system, and this is put again and again, operating inefficiently. And maybe there are some people here who are going to make this argument, because when you have the wind, it's intermittent, and so you have to have backup, and that's costing us extra fuel, and isn't that kind of damaging the environment? And this is a big swizz. And loads of people make this point. Well, I was very struck recently by the Sustainable Energy Ireland Authority of Ireland produced a report which nailed that issue, where they looked at exactly that point and said, right, is it good for us? And they said, yes, you have some inefficiencies, but overall it adds hugely to the efficiency of the system. And if we didn't have wind on the grid, we'd be burning 26% more fossil fuel, and it would cost us something of the order of 260 million more per year. And they said they had taken everything into account. And every time I get these complaints, I try to explain to them, have you seen the SEAI report on this? And they don't want to know, because it doesn't suit them. So it is a really complicated and controversial issue. On beef, beef is very, very environmentally challenging. A report, it was only this week I saw, it was in the United States, and it was done by scientists from a number of universities who published in a journal called the National Academy of Sciences. And they were looking at the environmental impact of various meat-related protein calories. And so they looked at beef, dairy, chicken, poultry and pigs. They didn't do sheep. And they looked at the calorie that you get versus all and everything associated with the environmental impact of producing it. You've got to have feed for the cattle, so what's the story in relation to irrigation for growing the feed and all of that stuff. So they looked at it all and they find that, and this is where it is a challenge for us. They say that beef calories require 28 times more land, 11 times more irrigation water, 6 times more fertilizer than the average of all of the other livestock categories considered. So it's off the scale in terms of its environmental burden. And if you were to do it in terms of staple crops, it says that beef requires 160 times more land, 8 times more irrigation water. It produces 11 times more greenhouse gases, and it requires 19 times more fertilizers. But we're not all going to become vegetarians. They made the point in this report that when the Chinese and the Indians start having more of our westernized diet, it's going to have an impact in terms of carbon emissions, because they're going to be looking for beef-related products and dairy. So maybe we should be working to try and get them not to change their diet. Maybe that's something we should try and do. And we're not going to be different in relation to that. I can't see our beef industry disappearing. And at the same time, I'm struck by why some of these want to be in the beef industry. Teagasc recently produced the Farm Income Survey, the most recent one for last year. And beef farmers are down at an average farm income of €9,500. And out of that, they have to pay themselves and find money for investment. And when you think about it, you're saying the Environmental Protection Agency said we should have better land management because the government says that, and we need to do this, that and the other. And you're a beef farmer and you're saying, that I made €9,500 last year, and they're coming down telling me what I'm to do. I have to say, when I read it, I did feel if I were one of those beef farmers, I'd be using words that you don't broadcast. Like it's a big burden and a big challenge that we're asking people to do. Very, very hard. And I think that clearly we need to do a lot. I need to do more. But I want to come to the issue which is kind of burning me a little bit, and that is about the target that we have. Now, the target that we have has been referred to there by Laura and by John. And you show how we're going to miss it, and how that is a bad thing. We should be doing more. And we face all of this issue. And it kind of surprised me about, well, and I remember reporting on the news, we're not going to reach this target and it's going to be a big impact. And maybe we might even face a fine, and maybe we're certainly going to cost us a lot of money. So I'm back to where did the target come from? Obviously it comes from Europe. And the thing which blew me away was that we have been given a most difficult target. A target that was known from the very beginning we hadn't got a snowball's chance in hell of achieving. It's there in working papers in the EU and everywhere else that Ireland was given a target. What happened was in 2008 they decided to set new targets for the overall European Union in terms of carbon emissions, because we're not responsible for all of the emissions in Ireland in the air. Like, we're only 4.5 million people. There are a lot of big population countries in Europe, and the air covers us all and everything else with it as well. So they said, this is a European problem, we've got to correct it. We've got to do something about it, and they set their new targets. 20% overall, which I think was something of the order of 14% overall, reduced from 2005 levels. And then they divided it up between the electricity stations, which are the emissions trading part of the world, and they're different to us almost in terms of their targets. We don't think about them. And then the rest, which is the rest of the economy, transport and residential and agriculture and all of those things. And they said, right, on that front, we need to get it down by a certain amount. And what we're going to do is going to say rich countries, we're going to give you tough targets, and poor countries will get relatively easier targets. And so Ireland at the time was perceived, it was 2008, to be, remember when we had a government which was full of rubbish at the time, telling us how well we were the richest in the world. I read and reported on all of these reports coming from Bank of Ireland talking about how Ireland was the richest country in the world, and it was all in property. And we had this thing where we were driving it into everybody that things are wonderful and things are great. And we had ministers going around saying that, and the pensions that they were building up and everything, then nobody's getting anything like that anymore. And we went to Europe, and these ministers went to Europe and said, yeah, we're a very rich country. And they gave us this target to reduce our emissions by 20% below the 2005 levels. And in all of the working papers, they have estimates in relation to, on current policies, what are the chances, what will the gap be? If you introduce all known new potential policies, what would the gap be? And it's incredible. From the beginning, we were expected to miss our target by 10%, which is exactly pretty much in line with where the Environmental Protection Agency says that we are likely to be heading at the moment. So I don't think we should be terribly surprised at that. I think we need to do more, but we shouldn't be surprised. And I'm not too sure that many people realise that that target is much, much, much more difficult than anybody else has got. They gave Luxembourg a very difficult one. They're a banking centre with a lot of emissions because so many people come in to work in Luxembourg. It's like driving down the road from Germany or from a neighbouring country. But Ireland is one of the toughest challenges. And built into it was that, and they knew that the whole system was that we will spend money to pay for the emissions credits that other countries aren't using. And we allocated €300 million between 2008 and 2012, a 5-year period, for those emissions. €300 million. For a target that was set for a rubbish view of the Irish economy, that we were the richest in the world. Set in stone. And so €300 million, when this economy collapsed, could have done an awful lot in terms of health services or in terms of addressing some of the social concerns which we have, or in helping in terms of flood defences or anything else. But we're paying it, and I do not believe that we are that rich country at all. Our targets are far too tight. They were made by poor negotiators, if you ask me. Very poor negotiators. And we are off the scale. We're up at the top. Luxembourg, Malta and Ireland. Everybody else is going to be achieving their targets on the basis of existing and new policies. And it isn't that we have done something bad and that we're not keeping up with the changes elsewhere. God knows we are implementing everything that's coming from Europe that's suggested in terms of an environmental directive. I agree completely with John in terms of our climate change bill. At the moment, you'd be very worried that it doesn't have enough teeth and all of those things. But we're not ignoring what Europe is telling us, whether it is in terms of what we should be doing on electric cars, for instance, or what we should be doing in terms of more wind. And we have this issue with agriculture. But I think that the targets are too tight. I think that the target that we have been given, that we're beating ourselves up with in terms of the guilt that we feel about the story that we have just seen. And I do feel guilty when I hear that story and I see that story. But somebody should feel guilty about this target that we have got. It is off the scale in terms of a burden for a country that has collapsed. Our banks are not back to normal. I was listening to Laura there, and this thought came into my mind about retrofitting my house. How I would love to do it. It was built in the 1970s. I'd say you could dry your hair in the middle of the bricks and the whole thing. You know, you go down to the bank and you look for the money for retrofitting your house. Will they give it to you? How much would you need? You know, where are we getting the money for all these things that we're supposed to do because the target is so tough? Our economy has collapsed. It is still collapsed. A government will tell you whatever they want to tell you. There's an election possibly next year or certainly in 18 months' time. They'll fill you with the stuff saying it's much better. I'm still speaking to people going bankrupt. I'm still speaking to farmers who are living on €9,500 a year, talking about how we can afford to do all of this. I think that's very, very real. And so when I think about what we can do, I think we should do as much as possible. As much as possible. And I wouldn't for a second disagree with the stuff that has been said by any of my two previous speakers, but I would say one thing that we should do. We should hightail it over to Europe and bang the table and say big mistakes have been made. Because there are new targets coming for 2030. And we're going to have to get our carbon emissions down by 40% as the overall target. What's the burden going to be on us? I'm not saying that we shouldn't be burdened. I'm saying it should be fair. I'm saying that the big population countries who have an easy ride in relation to the 2020 targets compared to us. Why? Because some ministers who were filling us with rubbish in 2007 and 2008 went over and filled them with rubbish in 2007 and 2008 about how much we could afford and how strong this country was going to be and how endlessly we were going to grow the way we were going to grow. I was listening the other morning to the story about Argentina almost back in bankruptcy. When you go that far, it comes back again and again and again. We're not out of the woods at all. So before we set these big, big targets, these personal targets for Ireland, and I really want to underline again, there is nothing that either John or Laura have said that I would disagree with in terms of we must do it. I feel guilty looking at the whole thing. But I don't want to be spending €300 million because some silly minister went over and said we could afford it. Because we've been given something which is absolutely off the scale. And you come along and you say, well, and also remember, you've got to crucify your agriculture sector. You know, you've got to get out of the kind of farming which you're at, should we? Like food security is a big issue. The European Union it was always very, very important in terms of common agriculture policy. Is it right that we should say that food security is now a national issue for Europe? It's a bit like when you had Helmut Kohl, he had a vision of Europe. We were all in it together and we were going to go somewhere and there was a different approach. And now you've got Angela Merkel and it's about you sort out your problem and we'll sort out our problem. We're not paying for yours. It's a different view of Europe. And are we being influenced by that? Should agriculture not be a European-wide kind of consideration? And I know John mentioned it and it does sound like you're looking to change the rules. But that is a legitimate debate to be had. Should we be doing that? Because what else has this country got? That is going to be very expensive to deal with, the challenges in that. Yes, there are economic opportunities and green technology and new jobs which can come and we can be world leaders if we were to invest. But where is our money for investment? I heard the other day, was it yesterday morning, a Finnish bank is going to come in and try and lend to our start-up companies. Where are our own banks? We need to remember that we're on the floor, and we're still on the floor. And I think we really, really do care about the environment and want to do the right thing. But stuff like that and giving us crazy targets and making us feel guilty about doing everything we possibly can that everybody else is doing and then telling it, but it's not enough, that's going to get dealing with climate change a bad name in some quarters. And I think that we need to stand up and start banging the table to make sure that we're not locked into something crazy after 2020. Thanks very much.